Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So, the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support. All right, everyone. So, for the next episode of Utopias, I'm really happy to welcome on an independent filmmaker who has made a very, very inspiring recent film titled King Cole, which is a documentary about Elaine McMillion Sheldon's life in West Virginia, in a small town in West Virginia, and the relationship that her community has to coal, community, earth, and land, and even history itself. So Elaine is just a wonderful Academy Award nominated, Peabody winning, and two-time Emmy winning documentary filmmaker. In addition to King Cole, which is what we primarily focus on, which premiered at the 2023 Sundance Film Festival. Elaine is also the director of 2 Netflix original documentaries, one called Heroin, with both an E and heroin, the drug, and another called Recovery Boys. And both of these are documentaries that explore the opioid crisis and the epidemics of mental health and the epidemics of a sense that many people have that they don't really have a home. They don't really have a secure life. They don't really understand what this country is or what this world is and what it means to be alive. So we talk extensively in this conversation, Elaine and I, about her own story as an Appalachian woman. Growing up in Appalachian culture, you'll see how beautiful and rich that culture is, like incredible art, incredible love of nature, despite coal, which is sort of both it's like the protagonist in her story. You know, coal is both the basis of the community's subsistence, but also the basis of their, in a sense, their destruction, and certainly the land and environment's destruction. And we talk also quite a bit about Appalachian storytelling and labor and the reliance on coal. So this is a conversation we recorded in October 2023. It's so rich. It's so inspiring. I think everyone's going to enjoy this. Please, everybody, welcome Elaine McMillion Sheldon and enjoy this episode of Utopias. Elaine, I'm so grateful that you could join us today and join me today in conversation, you know, as we focus on telling some of the stories and some of the questions and thoughts I have and you may have about your amazing film, King Cole. So thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So it's really a pleasure. So, you know, I wanted to just start with a little bit of your own story. You know, you've become a successful and acclaimed filmmaker and a storyteller, first and foremost. And I guess I wanted to ask you about what brought you to that path, and then especially in the medium of film and documentary films, you know, what were films that you have been or are very drawn to, and or filmmakers?
hmm Well, I grew up not knowing any artists or filmmakers, and my first inclination was that I love stories and storytelling, and that was mostly through writing and drawing as a kid. And I, never thought about film as a medium until after actually going to school for journalism and undergrad and writing and thinking about the power of a person's story in their own voice and me not speaking for them, and the ability to see people navigate their lives live like in this way that felt very scene driven. And once I got that bug of seeing things happen on screen and the thrill of capturing something that you really can't predict, which is reality, I just fell in love with the film form. And King Cole certainly uses elements of writing, so I've come back to where I've started in some ways with the narration and the writing. But it really, I fell head over heels with the idea that you think you have an idea for a story, you think you understand a situation, but the deeper and closer you get to something, the more complicated it gets. And that's just really exciting and never ending pursuit for me, to constantly be surprised, to have my um, perceptions challenged, all those types of things. And so generally I try to use the documentary form to teach myself about the world, and in that learning, hopefully communicate a story that's not just educational, but is also emotional, and that reaches people in a way. So that's what the things that I feel like the film form does really well, that I'm really honored to be able to use it for. And you know, the films that I love and the filmmakers I love, um, I think oftentimes they don't prescribe easy solutions. Sometimes they take surveys of life. So I'm thinking of Les Blank's early films where he spends the time finding this wide array of voices about a particular topic, and we just sit with them and we see their the irony, and we see the movement, and we feel the color of their lives in a way that is really respectful, but also entertaining. And I really appreciate that about him. I'm thinking of filmmakers like, even, you know, fiction filmmakers like Terrence Malick, or well, even Lynn Ramsey, who's a Scottish filmmaker, they're making films about place and how place and people are intertwined, and how both the image and sound reveal the layers. And so I'm pretty inspired by all forms, like experimental filmmakers, Maya Deren's choreography and dance work. Agnes Varda's most personal work, I think, is some of the stuff that really excites me. Alma Harrell's sort of bending of genre between documentary and fiction. So I don't think I have one filmmaker that's been a huge inspiration to me, but instead all these ones that are challenging me to think about the cinematic form. And I do feel like any good mentor, sometimes the most valuable mentor is a bad mentor. So because they teach you what you don't want to be and what you don't want out of your life. And so I think about the bad films, like The Wild Wonderful Whites of West Virginia, and these films that were really damaging to the psyche of who I felt I was and where I came from, and felt in some ways like they taught me how stories are so potent and media can be so potent to actually steal one's sense of agency through that story. That act of storytelling could be something that empowers you or steals from you. And so I actually think I learned the most from the films that cut hard, and that felt they were doing an injustice. So yeah, I love film, though it's a complicated medium. It comes with a lot of ethical challenges that I don't take lightly, and it just constantly allows me to push myself to ask new questions.
Yeah, and I very much see you as a storyteller first and foremost, and that's very evident in the writing of King Cole, the way you sort of present and take us to the same world and land where you're from, and I can see it in the writing, and I can also see it very much in the power of the ways you work with visual media and sound, and for me you're a great example, and of you and other guests on this show, of the importance of stories at a time when we're all inundated with information, where some of us are, and I don't mean this as a dismissal, but some of us are, reading TikTok posts or tweets as our form of reading, rather than perhaps something that's a little more longer form, where we're able to situate ourselves in the shoes of others, and even be present with one of the tallest oaks on the planet. That you spellbound me with that. So it's a lot of respect for your dedication to this craft across different media.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost it takes a lot of resistance these days to not just get your media from these bite-sized sources, right? And you feel at the end of the day, if that's where you've gotten things, sometimes this hungriness, right? That you don't feel like you've had a full meal because you've had these sugary snacks all day. That's what it feels like. And I still really try, even with I have a 2-year old, and it's hard, and it's hard to make work and teach and do all the things I do, but I still try to make time for the long form experience and the attention that comes to reading a book and spending time with a thought and contemplation. I mean, to make space in our lives for that today seems so radical. And I think it's so important in considering, like you said, putting yourself in other people's shoes, or just considering new ways of seeing the world that aren't bite-sized, that aren't talking points, that are complicated, that take in history, that take in the Mingo Oak story, and make it an allegory for today. So yeah, I'm greatly inspired by many storytellers who've come before me that are work beyond film, poetry, and other forms that just provide space for contemplation.
And an incredible contrast, as you mentioned, to a lot of bite-sized pieces of information that come at us that are often designed, at least algorithmically, to arouse us, to outrage us, to get the dopamine and cortisol to fire in our brains, versus, the story that you're sharing with us of coal, of King Coal, its relationship to land, its relationship to the mining community, which you present in a very, very soulful way. So, I mean, I think I want to start by kind of diving into the film in terms of the way you paint a picture of Appalachia. I know you still live in Appalachia, a different part of Appalachia. Appalachia is large, right? I'd always heard that West Virginia is really, really beautiful. I was spellbound by the forests, the architecture in the towns, the rivers, obviously the music, the dancing that you present. So I guess I want to ask you to, insofar as it's appropriate, to kind of help paint a picture for all of us who haven't had a chance to spend time in West Virginia and Appalachia, perhaps more widely, of what it's like there. Like, what was it like when you grew up there, and what do you feel like it's like now?
Yeah. Well, some people find the topography in the mountains to be claustrophobic. And for those of us that grow up here, it's more of an embrace than it is a, claustrophobia. And I realized that because I actually studied abroad in Denmark in undergrad, and a very flat country. And when I came back and we were driving back in, and my mom picked me up, she picked me up from Dulles in DC, and we drove back into the mountains. I just started crying because I forgot how much it feels like, it's not the grand Rockies. It's not the grand mountains in Washington State. It's not these things that get the attention, but they're rolling like an ocean, and they're worn down over time. They're the oldest mountain ranges, one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. And so, at one time they had this grandness, and they've stood over time, and they represent so much resilience. The mountains themselves, they stand in the way of our idea of progress. We have to tunnel through them, and it's hard to build highways in this part of the world. And people see these things as deficits. And I think we're coming to a day and age where we're also able to see these things as having unique value, and that these are the things we can't replace. We may be able to blow it up and take the coal out from under it, but we can't rebuild it, right? And so those are the things that maybe we should be thinking about valuing. So for me, that's the first thing that comes to mind about the region, is the mountains. It's impossible for me to paint a picture of the place without seeing the mist rise from them in the morning, and knowing that when you're in a holler, which is the valley between two mountains, you only get a couple hours of sunlight because you're so steeply in there. Some of the architecture, like in the film, we show this one town called Cass, West Virginia, that has a wooden boardwalk built in it, and it's a bunch of white matching railroad houses. And a lot of the things that were built in Appalachia were not built with a long-term vision. I think that's one of the things that people don't really understand about the region, is when we talk about moving on and transitioning and all that, this, like, long-term visioning is a privilege, and it has not been a privilege of the region. The region has been a product of boom and bust, and has been an extractive driven region. And so things were built for the pure purpose of getting the coal out or getting the gas out or getting the trees out, and they weren't supposed to last. And so it really begs the question of, now that those stories have come to an end, what do we want it to look like? Because it's almost in some ways going back to the before that time and thinking, where do we start from here? So I think about the unique structures that were built and how they were kind of built for temporary use, but how people have kept them up, and what they mean, and how they represent communal living in a way that we just don't have really in the US anymore. We're so isolated from one another, and we don't live in family groups like we used to. But the architecture and the spaces that were built show that they still represent, places without fences. There's not a lot of course there's suburbs across Appalachia, but I had a reporter recently following me from the Jacobin, and he was standing in my grandpa's yard, and he was like, there's no fences here. And it's just like a bunch of houses thrown in a field together, basically. And he's like, that's so interesting. And I had never thought about that. So this idea that, space is something you move in between, and that your apple tree is halfway on your neighbor's property and you guys share that apple, there's a very interesting idea of space and private property, because it's so rugged here. You're kind of building wherever you can. But I think for the film, what I wanted people to feel was a sense of being transported to a place that I assumed they wouldn't be able to come to. So I wanted them to see what a sunset looks and feels like, and to hear all the birds around you in that moment, and to hear the peepers down the hill by the pond. I wanted you to feel what it feels like to run through the fog and look for lightning bugs, because for me, like when I think about the films that stir me the most, they're transporting me there. And Appalachia, as it's mostly represented in cinema, is represented as a deprived place. And I wanted to show the riches. And that's not how we define wealth generally in this country, is lightning bugs and fog. But I find that these are riches. And even a dark night sky, I mean, it's such a hard thing to find. It's something we still have here. We have an incredible view of outer space here because of that lack of development. So sort of turning all these ideas of progress and, are just sort of assumptions about the things we need in our life on its head, and asking what's real wealth moving forward.
And amidst it all, you present people and miners in particular, and their families and their communities in Appalachia I would say in a profoundly humanizing sense, and which is really what it's all about. Like, what are these people's experiences and stories like, much of which hits home for you also personally, being from a family of miners. For me, I just felt a lot of ambivalence, like sort of like these communities love the land, they love the rivers, they love that tall oak tree, which I want to ask you about. They also love coal, and we understand why. So there's this kind of ambivalence, like there's a love of coal as a subsistence for people and their communities, and there's also a love of land in all its forms, right? All the elements. Yet these two are at tension with one another. And I think that's where you take us, without judgment, without prejudice. But I guess I want to ask you in particular about the oak trees and the rivers and so on there. And then, really about the how the cultures and communities of West Virginia in particular, and Appalachia more generally, engage. What is is it an ambivalent relationship? How are people in these places who recognize that their subsistence is also destroying their land and sometimes their lives and their families' lives, yet also recognize and even maybe not deify, but make coal king, right? Can you help us understand that?
It's so complicated, because I still stand by the belief that coal just happens to be the thing we've been told to love, that inherently there's nothing really to love about it. It just happened to be the thing that we, because the world was demanding it, to fuel the Industrial Revolution, to make the steel, to fight the wars, all the propaganda, right? we were told it was the most important thing we had. And I think pride is really overlooked in transition conversations about change, pride and despair and mourning, and how those things are really difficult to replace. A job is replaceable, but pride and sense of worth is very difficult to, just replace. And so I sort of, I we have been in some ways forced to love coal because it was needed by others. And that alliance and that forcedness is no longer, it's no longer wanted, right? Coal is no longer the desirable way that we want to generate electricity. However, there's still lots of coal being mined in West Virginia. It's still the highest form of GDP in our state. It's the revenue from coal is still the highest because while it doesn't require men and women to mine it, we have machines to do that now. We're still mining a lot of coal, not for power generation, but for steel making. And so it still has this captivation of people's hearts and minds to provide a potential way for their families to progress out of it. My dad was the first in our family to go to college. Coal was seen as like a stepping stone out of that, so that I didn't have to do that. And so that my brother, even though my brother did go into mining, which is a whole nother thing that my dad didn't want my brother to do. And so there's the element of pride that I think we overlook. The ambivalence is I think it's really felt, and people aren't allowed to talk about it. Because as I say in the film, I learned growing up that if I said anything bad about the king, I was betraying my loved ones. And I learned the tension between loyalty and truth. And through the process of making this film, I always thought that the way you loved someone was to not push them so much that push them in a conversation you felt like they didn't really have a choice in. That, when my dad was growing up, what other job? It was leave the state or work at the sawmill or work in the mine. And he wanted to stay close to family. He wanted to raise his family next to family. That was something that was a value of his. And so he chose mining. And so I never wanted this film to condemn the limited choices that people had in the past, but I did want it to call out our not complacency, but our willingness to allow this overtaking, this deity of sorts to redefine our identity, to redefine what was valuable to us, to allow us to destroy so much of what we love and what feeds us in pursuit of this job. Because I do think it's not representative of the values of sort of quote unquote mountain folk, mountain life, pre-industrial, behemoth coming in. And so I did want it to condemn the past, but I did want to show the ambivalence. And I wanted to show that actually the way we love one another is that tension between loyalty and truth. And it's calling out when the loyalty is actually hurting us. And at this stage, the loyalty to King Cole, which is just a, moniker, it's a ghost story, partly the film, that represents not one coal baron and not one company, but represents this sort of presence of the industry in our lives, it's not helpful to us anymore. Yes, we're still mining coal. Yes, we're always going to mine the metallurgical coal that's there to make steel. There's no other product in the steelmaking process other than that. But this can't be our only story, because we live and die by the stories we tell. And this is a dying story, and we are currently dying. We are a state with a higher death rate than birth rate. And so we have to be loving and honest about that. And so that ambivalence, I think, is felt by a lot of people, but they don't feel the permission to say it. And so what I'm doing through the film is saying things that are uncomfortable, but in a loving way that I think a lot of people feel.
Yeah, I love how you say that sometimes when a truth is known, and it sounds like it's kind of known by almost everybody, or the people you grew up with, or the people around you, or maybe your family, that loyalty and truth, that truth is not one to ram down people's throats in a self-righteous way. It always can work, kind of in a dance with understanding and compassion rather than anything patronizing, and so that is a very, very powerful tension that I sensed because I was so curious when I was watching King Cole how being so personally close to this story on so many levels, navigated this, how did you skillfully sort of ask these questions? Because in some scenes in King Cole, it feels like asking any critical questions about it is almost like a violation of your own community. So I just want a little follow
Yeah.
up on that.
Yeah, it did feel very risky. I didn't, like I said, I didn't want to alienate. I didn't want to condemn. I didn't want to romanticize both sides, right? You don't want to just allow people to move forward in a blind manner, and you also don't want to condemn everything. And so more than anything, there were versions of the script and the film that I think went overboard on both sides. It was easy to go overboard on being critical, and it was easy to go overboard on um this sort of like rah community feeling of Cole, right? And it part of it is tone, I think. So any film is like operating upon a certain, it's balancing tone, and part of tone is score. And so one of the things I decided early on is I didn't actually want a score that reminded you of traditional Appalachia, like in the sense of like old time music or bluegrass music, because that carries with it a certain sense of history and a little bit of romanticism about the place. I love that music, but we're trying to tell a news story about Appalachia. And so even the tone of the percussive score and making the metaphor of the king being a drum in our life, it feels critical, but it also is said, it's like when someone, I feel like my great aunts and uncles are the best at this. They like can tell you you're doing something wrong, but they tell you in a really loving way. And so you know they're not condemning you as an individual, but they're condemning the action, or sort of just helping to guide a different way of looking at things. I felt like that was the tone we were trying to take, and it was really difficult. I don't really know how. I think we just had to sort of measure. I mean, I was always thinking about my family when I was making the film. And there's lines in the film that I'm really uncomfortable when I watch it with my family that they're listening to. But I do think at the end of the day, they've really accepted the film. And my dad even said, the first time you watch it with your bias, no matter what your bias is, and you're looking for things that are prickly to you, the second time you watch it and you're realizing this sort of cyclicalness of history, and you're opening up to the idea of maybe you haven't been seeing the full picture. And then the third time it just washes over you as a moment where you're just like, this is bigger than me, this is bigger than my bias, and this is a very human story. And so I really appreciated his willingness as someone who, like I said, didn't have much choice, and then spent 40 years doing this job, was able to sort of accept both the criticism and the glory, for lack of a better. So I don't know how we did it, but it was the most important thing that needed to be done, because I've watched all the Cole documentaries and I know what they all are, and they're all very useful in their sort of social justice issue driven, solution driven. That's all extremely worthy, but it wasn't the film I wanted to make. I wanted to make a film that was far more ambiguous. I wanted to make a film that was far more about things we don't see, but things we feel, and the psychological side of these things, and how those actually hold us back from becoming, more evolved humans on this planet. And so I was talking to a student or a class the other night, and they were like, there's a lot of layers in this. Are you worried people aren't going to pick up on it? I'm like, I love that. Like, I think it's wonderful that you might have to watch this film twice to pick up on certain things. I didn't want to skate along the surface. I did want to be challenging, without being cruel. Because I think I just feel really lucky. I guess I feel really lucky to have been raised in a place where you're kind of forced to choose a side. Like around here, people have Friends of Coal stickers or Friends of Water stickers. These two sides aren't really true in reality, right? Like the coal miners also need to drink the water that comes out of their faucets, but people are forced to choose these sides. And I feel really lucky to have been exposed to that because it taught me so much about how so many of the things that we attach our identities to are oversimplified versions of ourselves. And that I don't know that if I would have grown up like on clearly one side of the coin, but also not, I was very ambiguous about how I felt about all this growing up. Of course, I supported, my family, but it was very difficult to see the mountain be flattened over time in the town I grew up in. And it was very difficult to see the place I love or the people I love, even, people in my own family who have, whether it's black lung or other things done to their health, who to this day would say, I'd go back in the mines tomorrow. Yeah, it was a very ambiguous. I just didn't want to shortchange the people by painting them as this black and white good and evil, because it's just not that easy.
I mean, I think you did an amazing job at moving into a place where we can just listen and or view and be present and feel it out, right? And that's very in a huge contrast to a lot of political and media culture today that likes to quickly classify and compartmentalize and place people into, you're either in this camp, or which means you're not in that camp, because perhaps being a friend of coal is also is means being a friend of work, a friend of labor, a friend of community, a friend of economic livelihood, right? You can be that friend and be a friend to water as well.
One of my friends said, I wish the sticker said friends of coal miners. They're right.
And that's what's up. You're a huge, not just a friend of coal miners, they're your family, your community, and the people that we meet in King Coal are amazing. They're really inspiring, and that's said in a very, from my perspective, with no exoticization at all of it, right? It's just like people are keeping it real, and that's what you're presenting, reality and the complex nature of reality, right? So, I mean, in relation to that, I think one of the techniques you use, and you've also alluded to it, and then we heard an amazing song about it as well, or at a funeral, is coal as king. So coal is, I don't know if the word is personified, but is sort of, it's placed in a protagonist position as sort of an agent, a kind of a living entity of sorts, a force to be engaged with at all times, and it's also almost connected in the way you beautifully present it as something that's mythological, right? And so I guess I want to ask you about how identity was constructed around coal and why you chose to make coal king, or present it as king. And as you describe in the film, as these jobs have been lost and there's a lot of economic hardship in such a beautiful, powerful part of the world, let alone country, are there new mythologies or new identities emerging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so I was reading, I mean, the film is, I think of the film as a documentary and a fable sort of all wrapped into one. And I made a letterbox list of all the films I was watching when I was making this film, and I was looking back on it. And it's a lot of fairy tales. There's a lot of journeys of young people also going through this coming of age moment while the place around them is changing dramatically. And so I was very influenced by that genre of thinking about how can this film not just portray the past and present, which sometimes is stagnant, but start thinking of ideas of the future. And my mom is actually the one that came up with the lines that are said in the film with, I asked her, I said, I know King Cole's not real, but who is he, Mom? Just over coffee one day. And she's like, well, he's not alive like he was, and he's not dead either. So I guess he's a ghost. And I was like, perfect. That's King Cole. Like he doesn't, we knew we wanted a character personified as King Cole because we're talking about the reign ending. And so to really understand that, you have to show things like pageants where women are saying, I want to share my love of coal and like invite you to the King Cole community. And these are we took what is happening in real life, where people name their festivals, the King Cole Festival, and sort of the surrealness of the community allegiance to it, and just sort of flipped it on its head a bit and allowed it to live in this mythical space. And that's drawing upon, the old King Cole nursery rhymes from the UK, and like this mythology around King Cole as this being, as this sort of like greedy being that will take everything and want everything. And we tried to soften the edges of that a little bit and show, yes, there's a greed to it, obviously, but there's also been coal is, we don't think of coal as nature. Coal was once trees, it was once forests, and we wanted to show that sort of magical process where, we think of this thing as this dirty, nasty fuel, which it is, it's polluting, but it came from a place of nature, and it came from an incredible amount of time passage. And we think of the past 200 years or 150 years that coal has reigned in this region as being our only story. But if we could get people to have this geological time span and realize that this is a mere blip, and that there were so many things that we identified with before this industrial movement came in. Can we recenter? Can we dethrone this one king in this way to allow all these others to be seen, and making the argument that we need no king at all, that model has actually not been good for us, that this mono economy, one of the things my producer, Shane, who I told him early on, is when I moved to Denmark and I studied in Denmark, the first thing I went around and asked people was like, what do people do here for work? Because I lived in a mono economy. I had no clue that other places didn't just do one job. It sounds completely ignorant, but here I am going to Denmark and I'm like, does everyone fish here? Does everyone? And they're like, no, we do all kinds of things. We teach, there's healthcare, there's, all these things that I just was like, whoa, like not everybody's life revolves around this one thing, because that's what it was growing up, is like your dad was the miner. The gas station only was open because the miners stopped there afterwards and fueled up. The diner only was open. The schools only stayed open if the mine was open. I mean, everything revolved around it. And so now, like, the new myths of today are, they're not, they don't have as much like folklore attached to them. They don't have as much culture attached to them. There's no ballads being written about the healthcare industry, or there's no ballads being written about, our largest private employer next to the West Virginia University healthcare system is Walmart. So nobody's writing ballads about Walmart. Certainly tourism is something that's growing, in education, forestry management. Natural gas is a huge industry, which is a whole nother beast, because unlike coal, where you needed people in towns to, exploit this resource, natural gas is a pipeline. Like you put it in, people work there for a couple of weeks and they're gone, and it's very transactional. And so I don't see many myths forming around new industry. What I see myths and new identities forming around is people looking to maybe the past to reclaim certain things that we lost along the way. And that includes like mushroom foraging and small business or small arts communes that are popping up. And it's all very micro, which is so different than our past 150 years, which has been, serving this one thing. And so that's sort of the future, I think, is that it's a more patchwork economy. I don't think anybody expects manufacturing or any like huge thing to replace it. And with the new economy, we have to rethink jobs altogether, right? And so technology has made many of the jobs we would have just replaced mining with, quote unquote, as not really a reality for the future. And so the long and short of it is, I think we look at this region as very particularly unique. Like Appalachia has this mystique around it, and certainly like the film plays into that. It's got its own myths of Appalachia, and like I certainly buy into many of the myths as an Appalachian myself, and I love all the ballads and the stories, and I grew up on them and they feed me. But I do think that the region is a bellwether in some ways, of precursor of labor in the future, how we don't need people, how we have a question about raw materials and where they come from and their value, and if they're more valuable than the people that are on top of that land. And so I think there are real questions and lessons to be learned from this region that the rest of the world is facing, that are it's quietly changing.
Absolutely, and that actually tees up exactly what I wanted to ask you about. Something you alluded to earlier in our conversation today here on Utopias is how coal has been an extractive industry, much like natural gas, despite the term natural gas, which is you pull it out from a place, you employ labor and raw materials of nature, and you pull out whatever you can, maybe never mind the disastrous and even death creating effects of it, to then create a resource that can be profited upon from afar. Natural gas case, like you said, it actually is literally in front of people, you can see. But you also, in King Coal, you show how, and you describe how this is being pulled out from these communities and trucked off or railroaded off, and how that, so we have that, and that continues to this day in lots of different ways. Even our newly emerging sort of digitally mediated world is one that also extracts data, right? Or attention, or the raw materials of hormones, of addiction in the brain, right? These are also raw materials. And then I think we can situate that, or we can let's put that on and then place that into conversation with what we see occurring right now in the US in a major way over the last 2 years, in a way that we haven't seen in this country in decades, in which is a movement toward a unionization power, labor power. We see with UAW right now as we speak, but we see it in lots of other facets, and Americans, about 75% or so, are supportive of unions, which is really interesting. So as work at all, let alone dignified work that doesn't destroy and kill people and the lands that they actually love, becomes obsolete and moved away. And I think of some of the characters you present who are like tattoo artists, who are talking about, like one in particular who's talking about, oh, well, I was in the mines, but it was just too heavy for me. It was too crazy. I've had friends that died. So, how do you think of this movement toward the protection of labor, or we might even say economic security, amidst the obsolescence of certain death-creating industries, but the presence of others still at the same time?
Yeah. We even having like a workers' bill of rights, like what are you owed, what is expected to be paid, and having some type of there's very little action taken against companies or individuals that don't do what they're supposed to do. They just pay the fine and they get on with it. And I think coal companies have learned that it's easier to just pay the fines, do it poorly, pay the fines, and move on, than it is to do it right. Because doing it right, if it's possible, if we're looking at extraction as a destructive thing, or is it possible to do it in a way, my grandpa who's in the film would say that we've been ultra greedy in our pursuit, and by we he's talking about most of the people that own the coal. So the land and mineral rights are separate in West Virginia. So that's one thing I'm not sure if people really know about. But when you buy a piece of land in West Virginia, you don't automatically own what's underneath the land. You have to buy separately the coal and gas that's underneath it. And most people cannot afford to buy their mineral rights. And they're also owned by, 100, 200-year leases from land companies. So it's very difficult to get. But there's just been this greed that puts the worker almost last. And makes it very difficult to actually take action if a company is doing something destructive. And because most of these companies are not based here, and because the land is not owned by people who are invested in a long-term future here, what's it matter? What's it matter if we bury the streams? So for me, it all comes back to, there's been these ideas of, and I think West Virginia may have put one in place not that long ago. They were trying to, about sort of when the natural gas boom was happening, putting aside money for, education or whatever. There's just no local investment, right? And so it's the resource curse. We see it in other countries too. We don't think about it in the US as much as we do in other countries, but the idea that if you have a resource, you're automatically set up that your development outcomes, your educational outcomes, all these things are going to be lesser because the people in this resource cursed area have to be in some ways subservient to the needs of that resource because it's being demanded elsewhere. And so that's why we have lower educational outcomes in West Virginia. And it's like, a miner can start out straight from the mines from a high school degree making $75,000 a year in West Virginia. And that's a ton of money in West Virginia. It's a very low cost of living. So labor is a very interesting and complicated thing, because I think that in order for the labor movement to represent the sort of like emerging technology and the people, what labor actually looks like today, the union has to change a little bit. And I don't know what that looks like necessarily, but I would like to see some type of, it's just so unfair that a person can spend their entire life working in the mines. And, I've made a film about black lung disease called Coal's Deadly Dust. And those men have to fight for their benefits. And the benefits are bleak. They're hardly nothing. And so the lack of dignity, I think, is something that really bothers me, that I feel like a stronger labor movement could help with. But I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area, and it's I just feel like it's so unfair who gets away with what, and then who has to fight for just the crumbs at the end of the day. And many of these miners, if they die, their wives don't immediately get the black lung benefits. The wives then have to fight after their husbands have died. And part of this is companies, we think of coal and oil and natural gas as like being these big corporations that are loaded, but they're always filing for bankruptcy and they're always restructuring. And there's this like constant evasion that happens that makes it really difficult to know who who owes you, who needs to pay that bill.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to situate this also in where the United States has headed, where there's a declining life expectancy in this country right now. And I'm sure that's true in West Virginia, and certainly true. It's actually true nationally. One, two, they're the youngest generation, so Z and younger. It's the first generations to make less than their parents, even if you control for inflation, which we know is pretty substantial. And so it seems like there's a lot of value driven by private corporate interests, that where death is worth more than life. So, I'm all of that. It's very grim, but I really feel King Cole helps us move out of that into the long form, into the story space of being with and feeling things, rather than just throwing kind of, grim stats at one another. And I guess what I want to transition to ask you about, certain political movements afoot, and how they do or don't resonate with folks in West Virginia and in Appalachia more generally. From the Green New Deal to I worked on Senator Sanders' national campaign as a surrogate and policy advisor, and he had mentioned to us about his time in West Virginia and how much like love he has with folks there. We, of course, have the quite influential senator from West Virginia, Mr. Joe Manchin, who is probably treading a tricky political terrain and has kiboshed um, various forms of legislation that probably would benefit the working class and women and mothers and all sorts of things. So, I wonder how you situate, folks in West Virginia, specifically miners, mining families, within this sort of environmental movement, and whether the environmental movement, at least, as associated with things like the Green New Deal, are seen as elitist, perhaps from the perspective of peoples there.
Yeah, I first want to say, like, it's impossible to speak. I have no clue how each individual feels in the region, but I can give anecdotes of things that I've heard. I think there's I feel, and my brother has said this before, so this is anecdotal about him. He feels that movements are like such as the Green Deal or something, it's like it's not taking in the full picture of our our lives and how we define our lives and how much luxury we're able to have in our lives. Like doing this podcast is based on how much energy we can waste. Right. And like, I think the reason why people feel so prickly in coal country about a conversation about energy is they're like, we know what sacrifices are made to create energy so that other people can have better lives. Like the quality of life in West Virginia is lesser than in other places by certain measures. And so I think they're prickly because it's like when people don't know the price of a gallon of milk, it's like seen as like a very, sounds very working class, but like that's a thing. That's a definite feeling here where it's like you can just blindly shop for things. So I have to watch this price tag or whatever. I think there's also a feeling that and I've heard this anecdotally, is like the United States has no problem, mining for rare earth materials and things to fuel the making of solar panels and other things, and be really destructive in other countries doing that, right? And be really irresponsible doing that. But we can't have mining jobs here. And so there's that disconnect where they're like, we think we're doing our job better than the US exploiting other countries. So there's that disconnect too. And I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, but that's another thing I've heard. But then there's just a lot of people that also want to keep their energy close to home. It's like, I know miners that have solar panels on their roof, miners that are like all about transitioning their home and their environment to have something that is more stable, more affordable for them locally. I mean, they don't want to be beholden to a big power company that's hiking up the rates more and more and more because it's, dependent on a coal-fired power plant. So there's a reality too where people agree with certain points and want to keep things actually more local. I think that's a big appeal in Appalachia, like keeping things local. But they don't want to get on board with the whole politics of everything. So I don't know. I mean, Bernie Sanders did great in West Virginia back in the day. I mean, we actually filmed some of his rallies, and my husband Curran I followed him for a day and did some different things. And like the love that Bernie got was pretty big. And it's because I think he saw the people for who they were. He didn't he wasn't trying to make a political point out of the people. He actually sat and listened to them, and he was finding commonalities, even if they didn't agree on everything. And that is so rarely done. And people compared Bernie's run through West Virginia similar to what JFK did back in the 60s. And I don't think we've had a politician like that in a while that's done that. So, and Joe Manchin, gosh, I don't even know what to say about Joe Manchin. I mean, he is, people in West Virginia call him a dino, Democrat in name only. And so the Democrats in West Virginia call him that, and the Republicans don't like him, but they like him enough because he protects their, interests in some ways. And he also benefits from the dirtiest form of coal. but he's also just like old, political. His family's been in politics their whole lives. Like, I don't know. It's very frustrating that he speaks for the state, because I don't really see Joe Manchin as very representative of many people I know in West Virginia. Um, I wish, I don't know how to do it, but I wish there was like a better story being told about, for lack of a better like word, just like the Green New Deal. Like, I feel like if there was a more inclusive um labor, like, I don't know, I feel like you could appeal in a number of different ways, but because it's packaged the way it is, it's so easy to for a certain person to take the Friends of Coal or Friends of Water sticker approach.
Absolutely. And that's because perhaps the fault lines that we see in a lot of this country and maybe much of the world are divisions maybe that are not about like a political party or whatever, but more about elites and the rest of us, and so I'm actually really curious about the one of the major theme of this podcast is telling stories of those who show care and actually practice repairing, kind of repairing and healing and these sorts of things. And I also agree with what you said with the Green New Deal. I think it was underarticulated a key component of it, which was that every single person whose work would be threatened would be provided transitional pay and training into a new, cleaner, and likely quite safer, quite a bit safer job. So Senator Sanders was definitely all about everybody having a job. And I think perhaps that's partly why he was appealing, because it moved beyond these little arbitrary elitist political camps, So, the theme really, and this is kind of where I want to close our conversation for today, like here and in the next couple minutes, is about care and repair, right? Repair, take things that might have been fragmented and bring them back together, repairing, you know. And so I guess I want to ask, there's you presented, West Virginia and all of those associated with the story of King Cole in a very soulful, very humanizing way. And I'm wondering how you feel now that the film has been made, it's out, it's getting attention, it's getting buzz. How you feel like we might be able to care for and repair some of the damages that have been done, and how you even maybe see your own role with this film that's, traveling all over the world, I believe, in that space.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do want to add one thing you said that made me
Sure.
think is I think the overall feeling, my feeling about the political environment in the region is an apathy. And I think that also people are disengaged, and that's not just in Appalachia. They're not getting the full story, right? And there's a lack of trust that this transition can be carried on by a political system they don't trust. So I think that's like part of it too, is like, that's a really hard thing to overcome. I see that within my own family. It's just a disengagement from politics. Nobody in my family is flying Trump flags and being really passionate, but they're disengaged, which is just as dangerous. And I sometimes find myself wanting to disengage, right? So I get it. Repair, my gosh. I spent the first like half of my career wanting to combat stereotypes. I felt that was really important. Going back to the agency thing, growing up, I was just bombarded with images of this place that showed us as deprived and depraved, and that we needed to be saved and we were victims and blah, 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 blah. And I just really felt like the world needed to know we were something else. And that's a worthy fight. I'm glad that I fought that fight. But today I feel more passionate about building us up here where we are, and almost building defenses from those stereotypes themselves. So it's not about proving to someone else that these these stereotypes aren't true, but it's actually making us believe in ourselves again, which I think is a much difficult form of work to do. And I think it's going to take a couple generations, but there's a real defeated feeling in the region that generationally poverty is only getting worse. We have so many children who are completely left without any support system due to the opioid crisis that has completely been fueled by this despair and pharmaceutical companies pumping pills in here in the 90s and 2000s. And I mean, this is so deep now, the despair. And so I no longer feel this external fight to prove anything about this place to someone else, as much as I feel like the story and the repair work needs to be in our own psyche, and that's where the bridge actually comes from, because we can meet at the table and have a conversation if we once again believe that we have something to offer. And I think that the region feels depleted, and feels that they don't have anything to offer, and that's why we're grasping. And so I think that's where the repair work and where the storytelling comes in, is reminding people of resilience and reminding them that we can learn resilience from the land around us as long as we don't destroy it, right? And actually, when we do destroy it, it's amazing. This place was once the most biodiverse region in the world and continues to thrive even despite all the things we put it through. And so that in and of itself is a reminder of the repair work that can be done with us internally. So I think that would be what I would focus on.
Yeah, resilience is such a huge part of King Cole. We see so much resilience in the people that are characters in King Cole. We see the resilience of nature, right? And resilience is the repair itself, right? And we also see so much care that people have for one another, and you clearly have for all those you feature in the film as well. So I just really, really appreciate that I had an opportunity to speak with you about this and ask these questions. So I want to just end by asking you about, first, of course, on a practical level, how we all can, all of our listeners and viewers can view the film, or are you going to be doing any of events? I know you've already done stuff at Sundance and so on, but also about where, of course, slow, as appropriate, like where you feel like you're heading to next. Are you working on new projects? And you've already been Academy Award nominated. Amazing. You've already had a real substantial set of achievements with great films. So, where do you see things going? Where are they now for you? And how do we watch the film and engage with you more?
Yeah. So we premiered at Sundance and we did a bunch of festivals. And then on August 11th, we started our theatrical tour. So I think we've been booked in over 70 cities now, across the US. And so we're going to be doing theaters until December of this year. We will be broadcast on PBS POV next year, so mid next year, and do a streaming window within, and then probably go on the internet after that, some streaming later. So we're not going to streaming quickly. We don't have a deal to do that. We're doing a lot of this on our own. It's been a really tough market for the documentary world this year. Most films out of Sundance still don't have buyers, so it's been tiring but worthwhile to push this through theaters. So go to our website, kingcolefilm.com, and under screenings you can see everywhere we're screening. We actually add screenings like every week. There's been a lot of response. It's been really inspiring to see how many places from like Montana to Florida to New Hampshire that want to see the film. So it's really incredible. What's next for me? Well, I'm actually having a baby in probably 20 days, so I can't really think beyond then.
Oh my God, congratulations. And thank you for joining us amidst that all.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I'm
Yeah.
excited. And um, you know, I think like previously to having a family, I think about my life in projects, right? It's like, oh, I want to do this, I want to tackle this, but I do think a lot about the restorative work of stories. What stories do we need in moments? I don't think I'll always tell stories from my region, but I also feel a lot of creative energy from this place. And so if something strikes me, then I'm here for it. But I guess I feel really satisfied from making this film because it was something I had been wanting to make, and not because I knew the form. I had no clue it would involve two casting two dancers and doing all the creative things. I had no clue, but I wanted to say these things for so long, because I actually felt a divide within my own family and within my own community that I wanted to bridge. And that was a personal thing. And the film felt like therapy because of that, and very scary therapy, but it was worthwhile. And it's paid off psychologically for the people around me and myself. And so I just feel very satisfied that I was given the opportunity to say those things and to be able to put something out there that has that tension. And so I guess anything moving forward is going to have to carry that with it too. I'm just not interested in, my previous films. I respect them. I love them. But the pure observational form, I think it's run its course in my life. I do feel like we're living in a time where we need space for contemplation, and we need space for asking better questions. And so I would seek films that challenge me to ask better questions about our situation rather than just observing life as is, thinking about what life can be, what life should be. And I think that whatever film or project or story that can challenge me to do that is the ones I'm interested in doing. So
Yeah, well, we're really appreciative for your time, and congratulations on having your, I don't, is your second child, because you mentioned
yeah,
you have one child. So
yeah,
congratulations on your beautiful family, and we're really really appreciative to have you today on Utopias. I hope we can continue to be in touch. You have definitely our support, and on every level we can. And everybody out there, please check out King Cole, and keep an eye on Elaine Sheldon and her amazing films and stories. I truly believe that anyone anywhere would really appreciate and kind of be able to do that kind of. It's a healing practice for me to have watched the movie. It was, and it was insightful and for me, and very helpful for me. And I think that's true for really anybody. So I'm
thank
really
you.
happy to hear about the film's visibility, I wish you all the best with it, and all your work moving forward. Thank you
Yeah,
for being
thank
with us
you.
again.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And I guess one last thing to say is if you run a nonprofit or you work in higher ed or K through 12, you can request a screening of the film too. So we're doing private screenings available for people too if it's not near them. So, but
Well,
thank
that's
you.
a
I
great thing.
appreciate that.
I mean, a lot of I'm hoping that this conversation will get out to the UCLA community, which has, over 40,000 students,
Yeah.
and the UC more generally, because I think it really would appeal to all of us, on our university campuses as well. Thank you again, Elaine.
Thank you.
Utopias with Dr. Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Jack Garland. Our episodes are available on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com.